I tried to shoot this last night and it was a mess. But here we are, we're doing it. And I'm very excited to have you here because it is officially 70s Animation Month. If you can think of a better name, let me know. I'm going to be spending the month of May talking about some of my favorite and also least favorite animated feature films of the 1970s. So today I will be talking about a movie called The Phantom Tollbooth, released in 1970. But before that, I would like to give a bit of an intro to kind of set the scene and explain why I'm fascinated by the animation of the 70s. And if you want to skip ahead to the movie discussion part, go for it. Timestamps will take you there. But first, I want to talk about the era in kind of a general sense. So, I'm tempted to try to summarize the 1970s here at the start, like, saying something like, oh, it was a time of XYZ and this is how it was defined and all that stuff. But I really don't think that can be done, certainly not by me. When we see specific historical decades portrayed in shows and movies, they're very often reduced to just like a handful of cultural signposts, especially in depictions of those time periods here in the US. So like the 1950s, they get reduced to the dress-wearing housewives and the workaday men who are driving home to the suburbs in their giant American-made cars. The 1960s get reduced to like flower power and student protests. And the 1970s get reduced to what? Bell-bottoms, orange and brown everything, and disco. But I really don't think that these kinds of simplifications are all that useful. I mean, they are useful for establishing like the time period of a movie within the first 5 seconds, but that's about it. When trying to understand different eras, different decades, it's much healthier to accept the complexity and variety of any given decade, because every single decade is filled with a variety of people who have a variety of goals and feelings about what's going on in the world and what their role in the world should be. So instead of trying to sum up what the 70s were and how that identity influenced and was influenced by professional animation, I want to try to take this series just one movie at a time. Just look at each movie and try to explore the impact, both from a historical perspective and also from a personal perspective. Because although I don't think this is something I've shared before, 70s animation had a huge impact on a much younger me. And despite the relative variety that 70s animation from all around the world provides, there are still these very particular surface level qualities of how the work tends to look and sound that ties everything together and at least gives the impression of a unified whole. So it made sense to me to try to talk about some of these different movies, very different movies, in one go. Also, another kind of shared trait, I think, between the movies I've selected is that they're really messy. In terms of visuals, sound recording, and even in concept and execution, they can really be sloppy and all over the place, which makes talking about them kind of messy as well. So I guess it's a good thing I happen to enjoy that. And best of all, the movies that I've chosen for this series are incredibly creative, ambitious, and weird, all in their own ways. And those are definitely qualities that I continue to seek out in contemporary animation. So who knows, maybe there are some lessons here in the past that the animators of today can take to heart. All right, let's talk about The Phantom Tollbooth. It's a doozy. So before this was a movie, The Phantom Tollbooth was a book. Do I still have it around? I have it, I promise. Here it is. Here's the book. This is a cheapo copy. I don't have the original copy I had when I was a kid, but long story short, this happens to be an all-timer for me. If I ever get tired of reading or I just want to feel joy in my heart again, I read this book. It's absolutely fantastic. The author is Norton Juster, who is an academic, an architect apparently as well, and a writer, of course. He just died in 2021, so pretty recent. And The Phantom Tollbooth is probably his most well-known piece of work to the general public. So what's the story of this one? Well, there's a kid named Milo who's just like very average. He's very fickle and kind of anhedonic. He doesn't find interest in anything. He is not excited to do anything in particular. So then one day, the story catalyst, a mysterious package arrives from out of nowhere, and he's transported to this world of like whimsy and metaphor that has all these kingdoms based around like abstract concepts. So for example, you have the Sea of Knowledge and the Mountains of Ignorance. Dictionopolis is a place that's all about words. Digitopolis is all about numbers. And over in the doldrums, nobody wants to do or think about anything at all. And I love this stuff. I mean, I still do. I think that so many of these ideas are just fantastic. I don't know, it's all still in my brain. There's a scene about subtraction soup, which is a soup that makes you hungrier as you eat it. So the reflex is just to eat more and more, which makes you even more hungry. I don't know, just fun, almost like a mythological idea or something. There's a crazy doctor guy who keeps different noises on little bottles until he needs them. And in Dictionopolis, they order words to eat for dinner, and naturally certain words taste much better than others, so you gotta pick just the right word. Just fun, creative, fun stuff. Kind of falls under the contemporary category of like fabulous fiction, which is very much my jam. So I'll come back to this soon, but all of these weird and funny ideas, they work well in book form. The book is filled with puns and wordplay, especially, and that stuff does not necessarily translate well to a feature film. So why did they decide on this project? Why did they decide to make this movie in the first place? Well, we don't have a ton of information there, but we do know that the movie was co-directed and possibly produced? No, it was co-directed and co-written by Chuck Jones, who, I mean, you know him. Even if you don't know him, you know him. He's the Looney Tunes man and one of the all-time animation greats. Sort of leading into this project, he had previously directed a short film based on another story from Norton Juster called The Dot and the Line, and that short won an Oscar. So there were no doubt some positive associations there. The Phantom Tollbooth flopped at the box office, but it did review pretty well with critics. But all of that stuff is kind of beside the point. That's just context over there. How does it feel watching this movie today? And what makes it interesting within the category of 70s animation, and more specifically, 70s American animation? First up, this movie is dated. It feels extremely dated in different areas on multiple levels, and the music in particular is very much of its era, and definitely not my favorite. In fact, I just found out that the score was composed by a guy named Dean Elliott, who also composed, well, for a bunch of stuff, but in particular he composed for the Dr. Seuss on the Loose TV special, which has the Starbelly Sneetches, which was a VHS that I grew up with and I watched it a million times. So I just right away I was like, oh yeah, this is the same music. Like, he's doing the same thing. It sounds almost identical. And in general, when people say that a movie feels really dated, that's very often a criticism. There's this general feeling that timeless movies are the good ones. Work that holds up, 30 or 50 or 80 years after its initial release. And I definitely appreciate that quality in lots of different movies, especially like art house movies. It's really fun when it feels like, oh, this could have been made today, like it was ahead of its time. But I also think that there's value in creative work that sort of locks itself down to the time in which it was made, especially if you as a viewer are trying to learn something about a time period by engaging with creative work. All of a sudden, dated movies are actually like a very valuable tool. So yes, The Phantom Tollbooth has aged poorly, and rather than reminding me of other 70s movies, it reminds me the most of 1970s television shows. And that comes from a few different production decisions for sure, like the music I mentioned, and also just the visual look. It's definitely film. It's kind of ugly, but I think the biggest reason why this makes me think of TV shows rather than, feeling like a real movie is Chuck Jones's involvement. And I don't mean that as a slight. Obviously, he's one of the best around. He was absolutely one of the greats. And I love tons of his television work too, but because I saw so many Chuck Jones or like Chuck Jones adjacent cartoons when I was growing up, like hundreds of hours worth, that's where my mind goes. That's where the associations are. I think of cartoons, I think of Looney Tunes specifically, and even like his particular approach to character designs and art direction in general. As I'm watching this movie, In particular, when I saw the face of Talk, who's one of the lead characters here, I just immediately think of Max from The Grinch Who Stole Christmas. Like, they look very, very similar. So while The Phantom Tollbooth is ambitious and visually interesting most of the time, there are still these gravitational forces kind of pulling it in the direction of TV shows and other Chuck Jones work. What's here is definitely interesting and even impressive, but it also doesn't really come together to form something that's terribly cohesive. And I think that's especially true when we move into the storytelling aspect of things. In fact, the famous critic Charles Champlin's review of this movie upon release specifically mentions how children would probably feel confused and lost in the onslaught of different character introductions, because this movie is constantly throwing new characters at you, most of whom only stick around for a few minutes. And I think that this speaks to a lot of the adaptation issues at play. The book was not adapted very well. I'm sure that it was a real challenge to even try, and that's because the book itself is kind of a hodgepodge. Locations and characters are, as I mentioned earlier, sort of themed around like academic topics, but also just like general abstractions, and that's a lot to deal with. So on the one hand, it's exciting to imagine how all of these elements could be translated into animation. For example, one of my favorite things, there's an orchestral conductor in the book who creates color. So like when he waves his baton, instead of creating music, he changes the colors of the world around him. So every day he conducts the sunrise and the sunset. If there's a rainbow, it's because he's putting it there. And I mean, that is such a cool idea. And for an animator, like, isn't that just gold? Like, you could do so much with that. And while I think that the movie does an okay job of communicating that particular idea, the execution is also a giant letdown. Like, it just kind of falls flat. So for anyone who's read the book, the film version is just packed with these kinds of disappointments. It's not the usual thing where people who've read the book are really worried that it's being faithful to the original. It is, generally. They pack a bunch of stuff in the movie that is directly from the book, but at the same time, it lacks something. It lacks a kind of like elevation or creative spark. So the movie is doing its job, but not much more than that. And for me, that definitely gets in the way of my enjoyment. So, at least in my view, this isn't exactly a good movie, but it is an interesting movie for a number of reasons. Number one is that I just like seeing Chuck Jones doing anything other than Looney Tunes. Obviously, I already mentioned some of the, interference or slight confusion or distraction that comes with recognizing some of his character designs in completely different characters. But there's also just a general level of interest to it. It almost feels like stepping into an alternate direction where his career, took him to all these other places rather than Looney Tunes. What if we had seen him get to try out all these other completely different projects and work with different properties? I don't know. So there's a novelty here, even though I don't think that at the end of the day, the execution is especially successful. Number two, I think that it's interesting that this is an animated movie about education, basically. That's sort of the ultimate messaging of the movie, is that Milo needs to be engaged with the world around him, and part of that is by learning things in school and applying them to real life, but also just having an active mind and an active imagination. I mean, how many of these are there? How many animated movies try to explain to children the value of education? It's not something I've come across really at all. The movie is sort of a morality tale in that it's trying to reinforce a certain kind of desired behavior, but it also doesn't feel as condescending as other morality tales. I really like the idea of trying to educate children on the benefits of education in the form of a wacky animated movie. I don't think it worked out this time, but the idea is so unique and presumably well-meaning that I just have to respect it. And number three, I think that this movie represents a very early effort in what would later become adult-friendly animation, or in other words, animation that works equally well for both children and adult audiences. So this is another point that was kind of touched on in reviews. It really feels like certain elements of the movie are geared specifically towards kids, and then other elements of the movie are completely meant for the adult viewers in the audience. And that was not a common thing at the time at all. and it's debatable whether they were doing this on purpose or not during production. But basically, at this time, late 60s heading into the 70s, animation was very, very much still a thing just for kids, and adults just had to put up with it when they went to the theater or something like that. But here, I don't know, like you have stuff that's specifically for kids, like the colorful visuals, Milo's band of buddies who join him on his journey. They're all very likable. I think that stuff works great for kids. But at the same time, there's so many elements that really would probably only work for adults. So wordplay, references to aspects of adult life, and beyond education and knowledge, the Phantom Tollbooth just likes to joke about more universal concepts like boredom and procrastination. In fact, the climax of this movie is just like, it involves a slew of demons who are all just direct references to like bad personalities and habits that I feel like would be more common among adults and better understood by an adult audience. So all in all, the Phantom Tollbooth is strange, marginally inventive, colorful, and kind of bad, but it's also totally unique, and I think that it's the perfect kickoff to a series of videos about some other animated movies that are also strange, colorful, and kind of bad. And that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for joining me for this one. Hopefully it'll be relatively short if I can cut this. But yeah, I'm looking to do several more, at least 2 or 3 more, hopefully many more videos throughout May about animated movies from the 70s. And not just from the US, by the way. I'll be covering plenty of movies from around the world. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you'll join me. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.